very challenging prognosis, to say the least. And it's, I think, an important lead into our next speaker. Over the last 12 months, I have to say, 18 months, I've wondered what's it like to actually be making the decisions that count, to be making the figuring and the forecasts that will actually determine what the policies are. And we have people who are doing that for us all the time in the treasuries and in the public service and, of course, in ministerial offices. I think it's an amazing thing, and I've said this at the first session when the Assistant Treasurer, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, David Gruen, was here. I think it's an amazing thing that we have a country in which public servants of such senior level are prepared to come out on an evening, having weathered the crisis or not, having still had the decisions ahead of them, to speak to a public forum like this. And I think we're very grateful to Guy for doing just that. Dr. Guy Debelle is Assistant Governor at the Financial Markets of the Reserve Bank of Australia. He has been at the Reserve Bank since, in that position since March 2007. Good timing, you'd have to say. He joined the Reserve Bank in 1994 and has worked in the Economics Research and Economics Analysis departments, including as head of that department and as head of International Department. He has also worked at the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, Australian Treasury, and is a visiting professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He graduated from the University of Adelaide with an honours degree in economics and gained his PhD in economics at MIT. I'd like to welcome Dr. Guy Debelle.
Thanks very much, Eric, and the Whitlam Institute for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. Unfortunately, I'm a blog-free zone, so I haven't got a blog I can stick up there. And I'm also an ignorant economist, according to Steve, so I'm not sure that really there's much point in listening to what I've got to say because I'm completely ignorant. I'm very happy to be here to talk about John's paper, and I'd actually commend that you read the publication he's put out for the Whitlam Institute, which is a very nice and thoughtful piece. I think John mentioned this, and I think it is important, that there is an important distinction to be made between Australia and most of the rest of the world, in the sense that by and large, I think, our markets and institutions have functioned well and effectively. So in the face of the largest downturn in global output since the Great Depression, we've actually, the Australian economy has fared relatively well, and I think our markets and institutions have contributed to the relative stability of the Australian economy. But as John says, we really do need to question why this is so, and that we can't, to some extent, rest on our laurels, and we certainly shouldn't take this for granted and assume, that it may have just been plain good luck. And we need to look at the lessons of what's happened, both for ourselves and the lessons for others. But as I said, I think our regulatory system has worked reasonably well, and our macro policy institutions have, obviously I'm going to say this, but our macro policy institutions I think have functioned reasonably well. And we need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We also need to make sure that we're in a position to capitalise on our strong points in an environment where the Australian economy potentially is emerging stronger than most. Let me just digress a little bit and just comment on a couple of things Steve said. The last time Steve and I were on a panel was in Adelaide, which is my home ground. So this time I'm on Steve's home ground, so I'm the away team. But when I used to play footy in Adelaide, sometimes when you played in some away teams, you knew you had a car parked very close to the oval to get out quickly at the end of the game. So this time I have to get in a taxi. But one thing which is sort of interesting, if you think about house prices, and Steve showed you the picture of house prices going up dramatically, is that housing in the end is just something we consume, just like food, like your TV or your car. And relative prices of goods and services move around. So Steve could have actually stuck up food on that graph, and food would actually have gone up relative to some of those things. If you'd stuck up TVs, it would have gone the other way. So your TV price would have gone down a long way. So I'm not saying that house prices are necessarily fairly valued, but just relative prices move around, and some of them in moving around in the relative sense means some have to go up and some have to go down. The other thing about debt is that, I don't know, I mean, I've got a mortgage. I assume that some of you are students, so you probably don't have mortgages, but those who aren't students probably have a mortgage. When you go into your bank to get a mortgage, they lend to you to some extent, and your willingness to borrow depends on your expectation of your future income. So it's not, so looking at where you, and they do, one of the primary criteria they do use to your ability to service the mortgage is indeed your current income, but your willingness to go and stick a large, to stick a mortgage on a house, to some extent reflects your assessment of where your income is going to be in the future. So debt, sometimes, if I look at my debt when I first took out my mortgage, it's high relative to my income. Now over time, hopefully, my income grows and my debt relative, and also I start paying back my mortgage and my debt relative to my income fails. So if we're sitting here in Australia and we think the prospects for our country are actually pretty good, then having a relatively high level of debt relative to current income is not necessarily a bad thing if indeed those expectations are realised. Now you can argue about whether those expectations are realistic, but I suppose my point is that current expected income matters just as much as current income. Now, Steve has a reasonably well publicised bet. I'll have to declare some conflict of interest here, and it's actually a bet with a mate of mine, but about where house prices are going in Australia. Now, I was, if I'd had time, going to stop at the local Woolies and pick up a pair of Dunlop volleys and give them to Steve, because I think on the terms of the bet, yeah, okay, well, I didn't know your shoe size either, but I was actually going to give the shoes to Steve because there's a fair chance that next month he actually might have to start walking. At least starting in Parramatta, it's a slightly shorter walk to Kosciuszko than it is from the centre of Sydney. Let me turn to talk about to some of the points that John made. And I think one point I want to pick up is about the reform of the international financial architecture. And a lot of the points that John raised with his colleagues with his other 5 economists, I think to some extent are underway in one shape or another around the globe. At the moment, there is a serious examination going on of counter-cyclical financial tools. What can be deployed, whether those tools actually exist, or whether they need to be created, and that debate is happening at particularly an institution which the Reserve Bank is a member of. There used to be a body called the Financial Stability Forum, which arose out of the Asian crisis, and the RBA was on that. It's now been transformed into the Financial Stability Board, which has a much larger membership. It's a membership which is by and large the membership of the G20, which is representative of both developed and developing countries. So within that forum at least, and in other forums, there is a serious examination going on of counter-cyclical financial tools. Another issue which is being seriously looked at is the assessment of too big to fail, or too big to rescue, or also too interconnected to fail, which is a slightly different variant. Now, there's a reasonably well-known line going around that if, the problem with too big to fail basically just means too big. And, but the question is, once you have institutions which are in that situation, what do you actually do about it? How do you stop them either getting too big, or if they are too big, what can be done to make them smaller? And in that sense, I think the point John made about the share of financial services is actually quite interesting. If you look at the economies which have got the hardest questions to ask in this environment, it is the countries where the share of financial services was very large relative to the size of the economy. So Iceland is the most extreme example of that, where the size of the banking system was about 7 or 8 times the size of the country. Ireland is another example where the size of the banking system is quite a decent multiple of the size of the country, and Switzerland as well. The UK and the US. The US actually, the size of the banking system is not that large relative to the size of the economy. It's large, but not that large. But when you have banking systems which are multiples of the size of the country, and which obviously then have activities in other countries, there's the issue of how do you resolve a bank which is in trouble when it has operations in a whole bunch of countries. And that's a question where there's a lot of examination going on as to what might be the possible solutions to that.